another review, and this time we're talking more Transformers in the IDW Transformers Collection, Volume 1. And I already talked about Megatron Origin, but the way these collections are made and the way the books were printed is that you have like these big sort of event stories like Megatron Origin, Infiltration, Stormbringer, Escalation, Devastation, all that stuff. And you have lots of spotlight issues that come in the middle of this, and the spotlight issues are supposed to be like one-shot character pieces that focus on a certain aspect of a character or a certain event. And a lot of people initially would believe them to just kind of be throwaways, but they're not. And the spotlight issues are inserted back into this collection, so everyone is able to get the full grasp of what's going on, and they become essential reading for certain plot points that go on later. For example, the Soundwave spotlight taking place after Stormbringer and having some ramifications that come from the end of Spotlight Shockwave, and then a lot of that stuff being tied more into Infiltration and why the Decepticons and Autobots go to Earth in the first place and all that. So it's important to read these. However, some of the early ones are not necessarily as dense. So instead of doing individual video reviews of every single spotlight in this book, because they would all be pretty short, anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes a piece anyway, I figured I'll just do one video that goes through all the spotlight issues of this first collection. You saw all the titles in the intro, so I'm going to go ahead and go in that order. So the first one is Spotlight Blur. And Blur is a Cybertronian that is part of the racing circuit. He's extremely fast, he's extremely arrogant, and he's extremely condescending towards people below him. And it, again, brings back some of the Transformers caste system ideas of this guy being at the cream of the crop and appreciating and valuing the luxuries that only he can get because he's so fast, and because he's so popular, and to the point where like he has a difficult time just recognizing the emotions and practical day-to-day living of people that aren't him. And so he's very much like an airhead type, to the point where like there's an interview where someone asks him about like the political situation right now and he has no idea what's going on whatsoever. And he's so in his own mind that all he wants to do is continuing his racing circuit. He doesn't even realize that there's an Autobot-Decepticon war going on. And then when the races are shut down, he's just like, who cares about the war? We should keep racing. Why does this matter? And so the book gets into his head and deals with, in a lot of ways, why that mentality exists. Is it because he wants the power, or is it because he wants to do something that's meaningful? Is it like self-interest, or is it some kind of more artistic thing for him? And so he's kind of bouncing back and forth, and he's very frustrated with people telling him what he should and shouldn't think about these things. And so he's got two individual meetings after the races are shut down. One of his basically like repair guys decides to join the Autobots, and then Starscream comes to him and invites him into the Decepticons because he's very fast, he's a good ally to have, and he thinks he appreciates his need for power. He doesn't go for it, and then in the middle of the street there's an all-out attack between the Decepticons and the Autobots, and he meets Optimus Prime, who everyone's kind of condemning of this guy to begin with, and the friend that he said to join the Autobots, he sees they're dead, and everyone's kind of condemning like his arrogant attitude and his like his reliance on self and stuff. And Optimus says, "No, I think there's more to you than that. I think that there's something beyond that you should understand, and I think it's more about you wanting not necessarily to be better than people, but for people to care about you and for you to do things that matter." And through that, he becomes an Autobot and joins Optimus's war on the Decepticons. It's a good story. It's short. It's sweet. It's enjoyable. It's not written by Simon Furman. The Megatron Origin was written by Eric Holmes, and after that, we have a series of spotlights, just two actually, written by Shane McCarthy. And he does both Spotlight Blur and Spotlight Cliffjumper, and he's got a good style. Really, really simple. He lets the art speak for the story. He doesn't use too many words, and you're able to really appreciate kind of like the cinematic quality of these individual stories, and it feels very much like a day in the life of the war kind of stuff. Then you go on to Spotlight Cliffjumper, and Spotlight Cliffjumper is basically, Cliffjumper is this Autobot assassin. And this is where we get into the more political stuff of, are the Autobots really the good guys? Where Decepticons are talking about the fact that these Autobots, they wait and they watch and they let acceptable losses happen so that they can win the greater war, and they're very consequentialist in that way. And Cliffjumper, this guy who claims to really be the good guy for whatever reason, is like this very highly trained assassin that just rips these Decepticons apart, and he crash lands on this planet, which has got a very anime style. It's just anime world, we'll go ahead and call it. And there, the biggest crime anyone can commit is to hurt someone. And so it's a very peaceful planet, and he runs into this girl and her little brother that help him relax there on the planet while he tries to get in touch with the Autobots. And it turns out he crashed landed here because he was being tailed by Decepticons after he killed their commander. And so the Decepticons finally arrive, and they talk about how this guy is not who he says he is. He's not the good guy. He's not harmless. He's not like he's not this pacifist that doesn't like hurting people. He is one of the worst in the Autobot army. And so this little boy's sister ends up dying in the middle of this conflict, and he tries to prove the Decepticons wrong by not taking acceptable losses and actually taking the time to come out of his hiding and like deal with the consequences of the war, and to like be accountable. But it doesn't go his way, and she dies anyway, and he's there to console her in her final moments as he goes back out, guns blazing, taking out all the Decepticons. So this is a very good casualty of war story, where Blur was more about a day in the life. This is more about sort of the mentality it takes to be a soldier. And it's very sad. It's a really good character piece. And it's a good way to understand Cliffjumper's attitude, particularly under continuities. And this was the most human I've seen that character, and I really appreciate that. So after Cliffjumper buries his sister, he finds his way back. He finds his way back to the Autobot home base, and then he's gone. And then we get into Simon Furman's stuff, which is Spotlight Shockwave. And Shockwave is this pure, logical, calculating Decepticon that is part of the Decepticons only because it's strategically and logically sound on his part. And so what he's doing now is he realizes much before the war began here that this is going to be a war for energy. And so he takes it upon himself to infiltrate and do what he has to in order to find the resources to scout several planets, and from several planets he takes these seeds and plants them all over so that they can grow energon on other worlds, because he realizes that as this war escalates, the thing that's going to become most important is the energon, and he wants to become the balancer of power and control that fuel system that no one else is really realizing is going to hurt their war effort. So he goes to Earth millions and millions of years ago, where the woolly mammoths are, and the deep freeze has just thawed, and it's about to get too hot for the mammoths to survive. And so he's on that planet just checking on his crop of energon and making sure everything's going okay, when the Dinobots, who are part of the Autobot army, attack him after Shockwave has betrayed them in the past or deserted them in the past to come and do this. And so Shockwave has to deal with both the Dinobots and his energon crop, and the Dinobots decide to take their animal forms here, and there's a really interesting thing here where they're all not the same size. Because they have to transform into various dinosaurs of different proportions, they're all different sizes, which is really cool. They give us like a really realistic explanation for why they look the way they do, which is that the energon cloud, which is heating the Earth, makes it so that their computer systems can't handle the planet right now, so they take like the reptilian skin as cover to get in on the planet. And it's really cool, and it's really interesting. And Shockwave and the Dinobots both inevitably fall victim to a volcano erupting, and they both get buried. And the volcano was triggered by the Dinobots to begin with, in case they weren't able to stop Shockwave. And after the issue ends, we find out Megatron assigns one of his Decepticons, Bludgeon, I think his name is, to go over the entire archive of Shockwave's research. And then from there, we unfold into the next story, which is, or we unfold into the later story here, which is going to be about Soundwave. But that's essentially what Shockwave's about. And Shockwave's really interesting. He has this logic-driven thing, and he has this moment where he abandons his higher processors in order to, like, more animalistically fight the Dinobots, and then he activates them again, and he starts to feel things, and he realizes that he's evolved. And it's really cool how he's kind of pushing his humanity forward through his intellect. It's written really well, and it's more wordy than the stuff McCarthy was doing earlier, but it's still really good, and it really feels, again, like another snapshot of the war, but those events are going to become important to later stories. Then we get into Spotlight Nightbeat, which is basically a detective story. It's basically Nightbeat finding the mystery of this ancient Cybertronian ark that crashed and landed thousands and thousands of years ago, and in doing so he finds a much larger mystery, and he's kind of brainwashed by the end. Not much of a summary for this one because it really is just him following clues and getting somewhere, and he's a really interesting detective noir type character, and I really like Nightbeat. I really like how different that feels, and he's more of like a mercenary type than like a genuine soldier. He's more about when someone hires him, he goes and does his thing, and it's about him finding out things and reasoning and being like the more human contrast to Shockwave, where he is logic-driven, but it's based on curiosity, not on this need for survival, the way Shockwave puts it. It's a really interesting story, and there's a lot of stuff that happens toward the end here where he gets brainwashed that is not going to come out here, it's going to come out later. And so that one's good, and then we go into Furman's next issue, which is Spotlight Hot Rod. And Spotlight Hot Rod, again, moves a lot of these plots forward, and essentially what this turns out to be is Hot Rod is a soldier that goes everywhere on his own, and he's going to break out his old friend Dealer after a mission that went horribly wrong that he was in charge of, where everyone ended up dying, and he had to make a tough call where Dealer was captured, and he took this thing called the Oracle to safety because that was his mission, and he lied to everyone. He just kind of left them for dead. And so he feels guilty and decides he's going to go on a one-man mission to free Dealer. And his whole psychosis here is he doesn't know if he can work on teams because every time he's assigned to one, he doesn't know if they can trust him after what happened with his old team on finding the Oracle. And so he's kind of like this self-deprecating, suicidal type soldier that's always on his own and takes stupid risks and does insane things just because he kind of feels guilty. And there's a really interesting bit here where the Oracle is like this all-knowledgeable Cybertronian relic, but because of the advantage you can give any one side during the war, the Decepticons are using it, and the Autobots are going to take it and try to destroy it, or basically tarnish its ancient resting place. And so this is the cultural impact of war, which is really interesting. So Hot Rod breaks Dealer out, and we find out towards the end here that Dealer's actually working for Megatron, and he's double Dealer now. And the whole event that led Hot Rod to break him out in the first place to feel guilty was orchestrated by Dealer. And he got captured only because he didn't know about Hot Rod's secondary orders to take the Oracle and run as opposed to help. And so it's a really interesting double cross, and it sets up more of the factions and how the Autobot-Decepticon war is really playing out. It's a really interesting story, and it's about that point where this becomes a more ongoing thing as opposed to just being one-shots. And so the Hot Rod issue is really good, and all of these spotlights correct the problem from Megatron Origin, where the art is both really good and really good sequential art, so you know what's going on panel to panel. And then finally we get to Furman's Spotlight Soundwave, which takes place after the events of Stormbringer, even though we haven't read Stormbringer yet. And essentially what he's doing here is he's following Bludgeon, the guy that was assigned to Shockwave's archives after Spotlight Shockwave, to figure out what he's doing. And we find out Shockwave is, or not Shockwave, we find out that Bludgeon is taking Shockwave's information to mine all this like pure energon out of the earth and to take its energy. And so he's like waiting and watching and reporting back to Megatron to stop Bludgeon and his team. And we find out by the end that they're not there to take the energon for themselves, and Soundwave can't get inside their group and infiltrate them by acting like he just wants a cut, because in the end, they don't actually want the energon for themselves, they want it for Thunderwing, who is an important art part of the Stormbringer events. And so because he doesn't want another Stormbringer-like thing to happen, he decides to attack the Bludgeon and his team of rogue Decepticons. And in doing so, an explosion happens, and Soundwave, after being shot by an experimental weapon of Shockwaves, is trapped in his cassette form and left on the planet in 1984 on Earth. And it's a really interesting story. Again, it just talks about where a lot of these Decepticons are before the war escalates to Earth, and that's when we get to Infiltration, which is the opening of the main Transformers ongoing. And so this is, again, where the collection of these IDW hardcovers becomes a little bit more helpful, because it is helping you understand how these chains of events are going, as opposed to just getting all this information and then randomly checking back into random timelines. This is where the book gets really good. The spotlights, all of these issues, are really well written. They're all really interesting. They all give you great characterizations and great art and very distinct personalities in a way that Megatron Origin failed. So, after going through Megatron Origin, I'd say keep going and read through all these spotlights, because they were fantastic, and I read them all basically at once just because I was so into it. I read all 6 of them in maybe less than an hour just because I was so into how these stories were being told. They are really good. Obviously, $50 list price for this hardcover, not really worth it, but if you can find it for cheaper, it is definitely a good investment. It might ultimately just be cheaper to buy all of the issues and then just read them in the IDW collection reading order, as opposed to buying all these like $40 or $50 hardcovers. But it is really good. I do recommend it. It is very much its own continuity, but it is playing on the personality and archetypes established in original G1. And so if you know Transformers' attitudes, there's nothing about these characterizations that's different, necessarily. It's just a sequence of events, and the nature of the universe is a little bit different. There are references here and there to stuff like Unicron and Primus, although Unicron doesn't get a name drop, Primus does. And Furman is very adamant about keeping those characters out of his continuity, even though Primus shows up later. So yeah, this is definitely worth reading. Let me know what you think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said. If you have a favorite spotlight issue out of these 6 ones that I just reviewed. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time.